Hello and welcome back to Real Seekers. I'm your host, Dale, and today I have a special treat for you. We have a special guest returning to speak on the issue of Calvinism versus Arminianism or Molinism and that sort of thing. So, Chris Date. Chris, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me, Dale. I really appreciate it. I'm honored to be here.
Absolutely, yeah. We're honored to have you as well. I know we had a previous conversation on the issue of hell on the Skeptics and Seekers podcast. So
we did, yeah.
And that was a great conversation there. So, yeah, perfect. I think what I should do at this point, before we get into the topic, just because this is the Real Seekers podcast, for anyone who didn't listen to this Skeptics and Seekers show on hell, why don't you just sort of introduce us as to who you are, maybe give a bit of your own faith journey and that sort of thing, and then explain to us why you wanted to speak on the issue of Calvinism.
Sure. So I was an atheist up until the age of 20 or 21, about a year after my first son was born, and my wife was an atheist as well when we got married. I remember we were really adamant about having a justice of the peace marry us rather than a minister of some sort, because we were really adamantly atheist. I had mocked and made fun of Christians and Christianity. Having a justice of the peace wed us, by the way, was kind of a mistake. The guy showed up to our wedding drunk, forgot to have us kiss each other and read our vows. So, yeah, I would encourage people to have ministers marry them. But anyway, around that time, though, my dad and I, in order to stay close to each other, we would go on these trips every year, these camping trips. Let me back up a second. We were not any sort of Christian household. I did learn later in life, in my adolescence, that my parents were both professing Christians, but it wasn't a part of our home life. I never discussed faith with them. We didn't go to church or anything like that. And like I said, I was otherwise I mocked and made fun of and had disdain for Christians and Christianity. But on these camping trips I would go with on my dad every year, and not just camping, but caving. We really loved going to big, well-known caves around the country, Lewis and Clark Caverns, Jewel Cave, Mammoth Caves, and so forth. And on one of these trips, on these trips, I would grill my dad with all sorts of questions about his Christian faith, but they weren't questions seeking genuine answers. I wasn't sincerely asking questions. They were the kind of gotcha questions that somebody asks to make another person in his or her position look foolish. And I did this for a couple of years in my late teens. But then about a year after my first son was born, my dad and I went on one of these trips, and I was asking him all those same kind of questions for the first half of the trip, questions not sincerely looking for answers. But then literally overnight, it was as if my heart had changed, and the questions went from literally overnight from being these kinds of gotcha, hostile questions to being sincere ones, genuinely interested in what he had to say. And he wasn't an apologist. I don't even know if he knew what the word apologetics was at the time. And he didn't have great answers or anything like that. He just answered honestly how he felt. But for some reason, I found myself, at the very least, on the verge of believing in this worldview, even despite knowing very little about it. And so when we got back home from that trip, I launched into an investigation into what this new faith that I was inclined toward was, and became a believer, really, really soon thereafter, if I wasn't a believer overnight, like I said. And I just poured myself into Christian radio shows and sermons and things like that, books. I remember one radio show that I got hooked on very early on was Hank Hanegraaff, the Bible Answer Man, at the time when he was still a Protestant. And that's where I learned about the importance of apologetics and good exegesis and good, sound theology. He had a profound impact on me. So that's the story of how I became a believer. And very early on, this will be important when we talk about the hell issue. And I guess it's important here as well, on the Calvinism issue. Very early on in my faith, I came to the conviction that the Bible is absolutely authoritative and without error. I really don't know how I could maintain a consistent Christian faith if I thought otherwise, because as soon as I think one thing in the Bible is an error, I really don't know how to guarantee that anything else isn't an error. So from that very early on in my faith and up to this day, as fallibly as I do it, I try to believe what the Bible teaches when I think the Bible clearly teaches something, even if the conclusions that it leads me to are conclusions that I would rather not accept. And that will come into play in both the issues we're going to be talking about today. So when I got back from that trip and went through this process, things were really rough in my marriage for a few years. But after a few years, she became a believer as well. And so that's awesome. Anyway, fast forward to how I came to the place where I'm at now, appearing on a show like yours. About 10, 11, 12 years ago, I started my own personal podcast. It's still up on the internet, but I haven't done anything with it for a few years. It's called The Apologetics, which is a combination of the words theology and apologetics sort of slammed together. And on that show, this was before I started any sort of higher education. I had interviews on my show, and I would expose listeners to some views that they already accepted, and others that maybe they weren't familiar with. Some of these views I personally held, others I didn't. I was comfortable having anybody on to present a view that was within the bounds of orthodoxy, even if I didn't believe in it, because I want Christians to think carefully about what they believe, and it's hard to think carefully about views you don't even know exist. So I would do shows like that, and at one point, one guest I had on was named Edward Fudge, and he had just published the third edition of a book called The Fire That Consumes, which is a positive case for conditional immortality and annihilationism, the views that we'll be talking about briefly toward the end of the show. Actually, no, I guess we won't. We covered that. We covered that on the Skeptics and Seekers show, so that's where people can go to hear about that. But after conducting that interview and in the months that followed, I became convinced of it, and and then I was invited to become a part of a ministry called Rethinking Hell, and I think that's really when I started to sort of proliferate across the internet, as far as appearing on shows and things, because I went on to Justin Brierley's unbelievable radio program to defend my view of hell. I would go on other people's shows and podcasts and participate in debates. And so that's kind of how I got to the notoriety I have now. As for the Calvinism issue, I was a Calvinist long before I held to the view of hell that I have now, and had been defending it for a while. And I think it might have been after I began working with Rethinking Hell, I started to become more known for being a defender of Calvinism as well. And I was invited by a small independent publisher to represent Calvinism in a Two Views debate book, which I did. And I've appeared on Unbelievable with Justin Brierley to debate Leighton Flowers on Calvinism. And so that's kind of how I got into this issue. And then the last thing I'll say, because I know I've been talking for an awful long time, is that when I started my podcast way back, like I said, 12 years ago or so, I really wanted to get a higher education in theology. I had no higher education previous to that. I'm a successful software engineer, but I got into the industry at around that same time that I became a believer, purely based on my skill. And I've developed my skill and my experience over the 20 years or so since then, without any sort of higher education in technology. But when I became not long after I became a Christian, I had a desire to obtain a higher education in Christian theology, but I didn't think it was possible. Here I was, married with multiple kids and a family and a full-time software career. I didn't think I'd be able to afford either the time or the money necessary to get a higher education. But in 2013, my best friend and discipler at the time, he began an online Master's of Divinity at Liberty University's seminary. And that was when I discovered that online higher education was really starting to become a respectable thing, and something that is actually affordable both in terms of time and money. So at the beginning of 2014, I began a Bachelor of Science in Biblical Studies, a Bachelor of Science in Religion, Biblical and Theological Studies cognate at Liberty University, graduated from there 3 years later in 2017, and then later that year began a Master of Arts in Theology at Fuller Theological Seminary. And I've got this weekend, in which we're right now recording, is literally the last weekend of my degree, after which I'll have graduated with a 4.0 GPA. And just for your listeners' sake, I want to make clear, I didn't go to Fuller because I'm as left as Fuller is perceived to be by many of us conservatives. I'm not. First of all, I don't think Fuller deserves the rap they get, and I know I can say that as somebody who's gotten my master's from there. The faculty is diverse. Many of them are fairly liberal. Others are very conservative. But more importantly, after I graduated from Liberty, with whom I do largely agree, the issues of hell and Calvinism are two areas where I would disagree with them. But I largely agree with them. I'm extremely conservative as they are, et cetera, et cetera. I didn't want to do my master's degree in another echo chamber. I wanted to go somewhere where I would be stretched and challenged in the way that I think, but by a school that was still committed to the essentials of the Christian faith and still was recognizably Christian. Like, for example, Union Theological Seminary isn't even recognizably Christian anymore. And there are plenty of others, the Yale Divinity School and others. I wouldn't even say they're recognizably Christian. But Fuller is, even if they're more to the middle than a lot of us conservatives would like. So I decided to go to Fuller because I would be stretched and challenged while nevertheless being held to the commitment of Christian orthodoxy, and it's exceeded all my expectations. I haven't become any less conservative than I already was, but I'm much more equipped to engage in debate and dialogue with people who hold to views other than mine than I would have been if I'd gone to an echo chamber. So anyway, all of that, hopefully 10 minutes or so worth of talking, hopefully gives you and your listeners an idea of whom you're talking to right now. And any other questions about me personally, I'm happy to offer, but I'll leave it at that for now.
Excellent. Well, I just want to say, first of all, congratulations on completing the program.
Thank you.
Yeah, no worries. I myself was actually considering going to Liberty University for the philosophy program. I'm friends with Gary Habermas, but I heard the terrible news that they shut down that program.
Yeah, and I was really bummed by that when the news came out. I was disappointed, not because I am a philosopher myself. I'm not, and many philosophers just drive me batty because of well, things maybe we'll get to in the course of this interview. But I was really disappointed because I think that philosophy is an important discipline, and the news really disappointed me. However, what I will say is that since that news came out, it's been explained by the administration that the program wasn't cut because they don't value philosophy. The program was cut because there wasn't enough interest on the part of incoming students to get degrees in philosophy. And I can, at the very least, sympathize with an administration that has to, of a school that is, especially one that's privately funded, for a school to, I'm sympathetic to a school's needs to be able to survive in terms of finances. And I don't know how a school could necessarily afford a program that has such a small number of people interested in pursuing that program. And so I think that my disappointment has shifted a little bit, away a little bit from Liberty, although I am disappointed with them for other reasons, like the administration's position on Donald Trump. But away from disappointment with them, and it's more disappointment now on my part in the next generation of Christians seeking higher education, because too few of them now, it seems, are interested in focusing on philosophy. And although I don't have a high opinion of some philosophers and the way they work, I do have a high opinion of philosophy, and I think we need more good Christian philosophers. So I'm kind of disappointed that fewer Christians than should be are interested in pursuing philosophy.
Well said. Yeah, I agree 100% with that. I think that it's an important aspect. I mean, I think it was Alvin Plantinga who says philosophy is just thinking hard about things. I agree with that take there. So, all right, cool. So yeah, let's sort of move into the actual topic, or main topic today, which is going to be the Calvinism issue. And maybe it might be best, because I know that you, based on your book, you wanted to sort of focus in on a couple aspects in particular, but maybe just in a brief statement, why don't you get us familiar with what Calvinism is in general, and the thing called the tulip doctrines or something, and just sort of give us a brief summary of what it is in general.
Sure. Calvinism is a label applied to views that is most associated with the theologian who bears his name, John Calvin, from the Protestant Reformation. but they represent views that stretch much back further in time than him. And I'm not going to make the claim that the earliest church was Calvinistic or anything. That would be terribly anachronistic. But I do see in the teaching, I do see sort of inchoate or nascent forms of this Calvinistic worldview in some of the early fathers, which is not necessarily the focus of our discussion today. But anyway, Calvinism is just a word to describe a set of views, and that set of views is at least partly captured by the acronym TULIP. TULIP stands for 5 phrases, and I'll go through them one by one. The first is total depravity. This is the view that human beings aren't as evil as they could possibly be, but that evil affects everything that they feel, think, and do. So it's total in the sense that every single thing that we think, choose, or do is affected by our sinfulness, and that sinfulness is the result of Adam's fall. I think those of us who affirm total depravity would say that it's because of original sin, the sin of Adam and Eve in the garden. It's because of that all human beings are conceived in sin, and sin and they are oriented to sin from the moment of conception. So their choices, their actions are brought about because they are oriented toward sinning. So that's total depravity, and there's sort of a corollary, total inability, which is the idea that because human beings are totally depraved and because sinful rebelliousness affects all of our decisions, we're therefore unable, or so the phrase total inability says, unable to choose God of our own and to choose good of our own volition, because we are oriented away from God and away from goodness and toward evil and sinfulness. So that's total depravity. And what your listeners will notice is that this is sort of a logical chain as well. Although each of these views is independent from the others, nevertheless, they logically fit together very well. And so, for example, if it's true that humans are totally depraved and that sin and rebellion affects all of their choices and actions, and renders them totally unable, again, to use the language of that phrase, to choose God and goodness of their own accord, well, then the question becomes, well, how does anybody accept God and accept and pursue the good? And this is where the U comes in, which is unconditional election. This is the idea that the elect, the saved, are preordained or foreordained to be saved by God, and not conditioned on anything in the person that is foreordained to be saved. So we would say that I and you are saved, are preordained, foreordained, decreed, however you want to put it, to be saved, not because of anything God knew that we are or would be or do. Rather, it's solely based on His own will and His own His own desires. It's only according to those that God foreordains who the elect will be. So that's why it's called unconditional election. And by contrast, virtually every other form of non-Calvinism would affirm some sort of conditional election, meaning that people are elected because God knows what they will choose, or because of what they did choose, or whatever. The only exception is arguably Molinism. Some Molinists would say that the elect are in fact unconditionally chosen by God at the time when God is deciding amongst possible worlds which one to instantiate or realize, and that's something we can discuss at some point if you so choose. So that's unconditional election, and you can see how that sort of follows logically from total depravity. So then the question becomes, well, if God has chosen a group of people to save, having nothing to do with those people and who they are or what and do, then the question, or what they are and what they choose and do, then the question becomes, well, how does God secure the salvation of these people that He has chosen? And that's where the L comes in, which is short for limited atonement. And this doesn't mean that the atoning work of Christ is somehow finite or limited in its quality or its power or anything like that. Rather, it's limited in scope. According to 5-point Calvinists like me, Jesus did not die as a substitute for the entire world, the entire human race all through time. Rather, He died on behalf of, in the place of, as a substitute for those that God chose, the elect. And so if he had, we would say, died in the place of people that aren't part of the elect, then there would be no grounds for those people to be punished because God in Christ has already borne that punishment. But if he died only for those God chose to be saved, then it would make sense that because Christ bore their punishment in their place, therefore they are saved, and those for whom he didn't die are punished for their own sins because they haven't accepted the substitutionary, because Christ hasn't acted as a substitute in dying for them. So that's limited atonement. The I is irresistible grace, and the reason why this flows from the previous letters is because if people were totally depraved and wouldn't have chosen God, and if God therefore unconditionally chooses a subset of human beings to be saved and becomes incarnate and dies in their place so that they will instead be saved, then the question becomes, well, how do the elect become people who embrace this atoning work of Christ on their behalf? In other words, how do those who exercise faith get to the point of exercising faith? And that's where irresistible grace comes in. The idea is not that human beings are resisting God's grace but can't resist it and so therefore are converted and saved. That's not what irresistible grace means. It just means that God's choice to save the elect and his choice that the elect would exercise saving faith in time, that choice is brought about perfectly. It's guaranteed. There's no way that what he has foreordained won't come to pass. So that's irresistible grace. The God's choice to bring about the elect is perfect and will irresistibly happen. There's no way that his choice that the elect would be saved won't in fact be saved. And then finally there's P, which is the perseverance of the saints. And this is sometimes called eternal security, or even sometimes more crudely, once saved, always saved. And this is the idea that if God has chosen a subset of humanity to be saved, and if he has become incarnate and died on their behalf, and if he has guaranteed that the people he has chosen will indeed exercise saving faith in time in the atoning work of Christ on their behalf, then it follows that, and we think that it's taught in Scripture as well, that those that God has so chosen will be saved in time, express saving faith in Christ, and will persevere until they die and their decision is secured or is finalized. So that's the perseverance, but it's a little bit. I mean, we would say that in time it is an act of perseverance on the saints' part, but it's equally true that the reason that the saints persevere is because God has foreordained that they would persevere, and that's why it's a little bit questionable whether perseverance of the saints is the right way to put it. It might be better to say perseverance of God and the saints or something like that. But anyway, so that's TULIP. But here's the thing. I mean, I do affirm all 5 of those points, but several of those points, it seems to me, are really just outworkings of a more underlying principle that underlines this whole TULIP thing. And it starts with the letter S, and that's why people like James White and I would say that you might actually call us 6-point Calvinists, in the sense that we think there's a point that comes even before the T. We would say it's STULIP rather than TULIP, because we think that even underlying all of these things is the idea of divine sovereignty. Now, of course, people that are not Calvinists don't deny that God is sovereign. They just understand sovereignty differently than we do, and that's fine. I don't dispute that. But given the way we Calvinists understand sovereignty, or at least many of us Calvinists, we think that God exercises something called meticulous divine providence, which is the idea that everything that takes place in time, everything down to the smallest detail, was perfectly foreordained by God in eternity past. So everything that takes place in time has been foreordained by God. He exercises providence not just over some things, but over everything. And because we have that conviction, several of those points of TULIP sort of flow from that belief in divine sovereignty. Take, for example, the idea of total depravity, which and its corollary, total inability. We would say that God perfectly foreordains who is going to embrace Christ and be saved, and sometimes the means by which God will accomplish what he has foreordained is through secondary causes. So, for example, one person might reject Christ and remain that way for the rest of his or her life because of circumstances into which that person is born and finds him or herself over time. What's the point I'm trying to get here? Oh, so they are unable, in a sense of that word, to choose Christ because of these conditions that are in play, and God has perfectly foreordained that those conditions would be in play. So you can see how that's one example of the kind of condition in time that could lead to or bring about God's foreordination that people would be unable to accept Christ in time, and there are other ways that we could work it out as well. So, but anyway, so that's in a nutshell. We've got these 5 points of Calvinism: total depravity, unconditional election, limited atonement, irresistible grace, and perseverance of the saints. And then underlying all of these, sort of being the foundation of all of these, is the sovereignty of God, specifically the way that we Calvinists understand divine sovereignty.
Wow. So you can tell this guy's a pro.
I'm not a pro. No, I'm not. I get into a lot of debates over this. That's all.
There you go. Yeah. But yeah, you helped transition into the next question. This was really the first aspect that you wanted to focus on, this S in this 6-point Calvinism, as you call it. And that's, I think you call it meticulous divine providence and its relation to compatibilism and that sort of thing. So, yeah, just before we move on, are you satisfied with your making like an opening case for that, or is there anything else you wanted to add on the meticulous divine providence and what your view of that entails?
No, I'd be happy to make as brief of a case as I can for, sure. Yeah, and just to be, as I said earlier, what fuels my conviction here is not philosophy or moral intuitions or anything like that. It's not about what I would like to be the case or anything like that. And I'm not saying that's the case with people who aren't Calvinists either. But for me, I feel the conviction that I've got to accept what I see Scripture teaching, even if I'm wrong about that. I can't know that I'm wrong about that until somebody demonstrates that I am. And so until somebody demonstrates that I'm wrong about the way these texts read, I feel like I've got to make the best sense of what they teach rather than try and find a different way to read them. Although I'd like to think I am open to alternative readings, I just don't find any of them to be plausible readings of the text. So let me walk through a few texts that I think illustrate meticulous divine providence and compatibilism. Maybe I should explain what compatibilism is first. Do you think that would make sense?
Yeah, sure.
Okay, so we've talked about what meticulous divine providence is. Compatibilism is a word for a particular view of free will. So most people who use the phrase free will or the word freedom when talking about human moral choices and things, they typically have in mind what philosophers call libertarian free will, which, to put it sort of simplistically, is the freedom and the ability to do A or to not do A. Or the way you could put it is to do A or to do not A. All right. So everybody exercises a genuine choice between what they do decide to do and what they could have otherwise genuinely chosen to do. Compatibilism is instead the idea that human free will and human moral accountability is compatible with divine determinism. That's what compatibilism means. Sometimes people mistake it as meaning that that human freedom and God's freedom are compatible or something like that, but that's really not what the phrase means. It means that human moral accountability is compatible with divine determinism or theistic determinism. And I suppose technically an atheist could affirm compatibilism as well, and it would just be materialistic determinism that they are saying freedom is compatible with, or that moral accountability is compatible with. So in the text that I'm going to be looking at, or at least some of them, what I think one will see is that humans are choosing to do things and are held legitimately accountable for doing those things, but at the same time, they have been predetermined by God to do what they do. That's the case I'm going to be making from these texts, or at least some of them. All right. All the texts I'm going to be reading here I'm intending to show, at least in part, this concept of meticulous divine providence. Some of these texts will also, I think, illustrate this concept of compatibilistic free will, the idea that the humans can be genuinely held accountable for acts they choose to do, even though what the acts that they've chosen to do were predetermined by God. So The first text that I turn to in my book is Genesis 12, 1 and 2. This is the Abrahamic covenant that God makes with Abraham. He says, I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you, and I will make your name great. And notice this isn't just a prophecy that Abraham's descendants would, at some point in time, constitute a great nation, as impressive as that prediction might be. Rather, God is here promising that he will be the one to make it happen. Now, this isn't insignificant. Being made into a great nation requires several generations of increasing progeny, greater and greater numbers of children in subsequent generations, which in turn requires not just fruitful wombs, like God opening up people's wombs, but also countless acts of human agency in the form of, children might need to have their ears covered or something like that, but in the form of copulation, sexual activity. Moreover, active sex lives and fruitful wombs may be all that is required if one is to be made a great people, but here Abraham is told he will be made a great nation. So now it also requires territory. And as readers of Genesis go on to read, the territory that God promises Abraham is already inhabited when his descendants arrive there. And he brings about that they take it by force. Well, so here again are involved countless acts of human agency, the willingness of thousands to march into battle, the retreat or surrender of enemy soldiers and rulers, the hundreds and thousands of individual strikes and blows, parries and dodges that win battles in time. So God's promise to make Abraham into a great nation implies, implicitly, divine providence over a practically limitless number of free acts of human agency. Another example that I like to bring about is, let me just, for the sake of time, move on to another text. In Genesis 20, 1 and 2, Abraham and Sarah are sojourning in Gerar, and they claim to be brother and sister in order that they are so that he isn't killed, so that Abraham isn't killed and Sarah taken as somebody's wife. And Abimelech attempts to take Sarah as his wife, but the Lord appears to him in a dream and condemns him to death. But having not yet slept with Sarah, Abimelech pleads innocence. He says, "In the integrity of my heart and in the innocence of my hands, I have done this." Now, this is where compatibilism comes into play, because God affirms the king's agency and innocence. God says, yes, I know that you have done this in the integrity of your heart. So Abimelech was no automaton. He made a genuinely free and moral decision. But at the same time, we witness God's providence over human agency, because he goes on to say, it was I who kept you from sinning against you, and therefore I did not let you touch her. So here again, you've got humans being held accountable for their actions, and you've got God predetermining those actions. We see that also in the story of David and Abigail in 1 Samuel 12, 13, and 22. David resolves to have Nabal killed. That's in, again, 1 Samuel 25, 13, and 22. And Nabal's wife urges, Nabal's wife is Abigail, she urges David to forgive Nabal and thereby avoid shedding innocent blood or taking vengeance into his own hands. That's in verses 23 to 31. But while affirming David's agency, in anticipation of his acquiescence, his willing to change his mind, Abigail also affirms the Lord's providence, saying the Lord has restrained you from blood guilt and from saving with your or slaying with your own hand. So David likewise affirms Abigail's agency, not just Abigail affirming Nabal, but now David affirms Abigail's, because he blesses her for staying his hand. But he also credits God with doing so in verse 39, and with sending her in verse 32, and preventing him from killing her in verse 34. So we see that the God is behind all of these actions by David and Abigail. One more I'll offer that I think is really powerful, and then I will, I'll offer two more, and then I'll stop because I keep going on forever. In Genesis...
Chris, just before so in terms of time, I want you to take as much time as you need to make the best case, because you're the guest and it's a probing interview. So as long as you're not constrained by time, it doesn't have to end by a certain point. So yeah, take as much time as you need to make your best case.
Sure, I appreciate that. I just, for the sake of listeners who might be find my voice grating and they've got to sort of tolerate me speaking forever, I'm going to try to keep it as brief as I can. But two more incidents that I find particularly powerful are Genesis 24. This is where Abraham has sent his servant to find a wife for Isaac. And at the well of Nahor, Abraham's servant prays that the Lord would reveal the woman that he has appointed for Isaac by letting her offer water for both the servant and the camels. God's favorable response to Abraham's servant's prayer is immediate and unmistakable because this beautiful woman named Rebekah arrives on the scene before Abraham's servant is even finished praying. And she does exactly what Abraham's servant had prayed that she would do. That's in verses 15 through 20. Now, it's easy to overlook the degree of providence required to bring about the answer to the prayer of Abraham's servant. But in reality, a great number of human acts of agency have got to have been involved. So here's just a sample of the list of those actions. Rebekah didn't only grant the servant's request for water, she also volunteered to water his camels as well. She left for the well at precisely the time necessary and walked at the rate necessary to arrive just as the servant finished praying. She and her family had finished consuming all of their water at just the right time to prompt her need at this moment to retrieve more water in the first place. And leading up until this time, either countless suitors had chosen not to propose to her despite Rebekah's beauty, or her family had chosen to turn down all of the requests of all of the countless suitors that would have been pursuing her. Her kindness to Abraham's servant was surely owing in part, at least, to excellent parenting by her father and mother, and they had married and conceived at just the right time for Rebekah to be of the age for Abraham's servant to approach her in the first place. And then surely there are countless other acts of human agency that made this scene possible as well. So here's an example where we see God's foreordaining decree necessary in order for the myriad millions of human actions through time to converge on what we see happening here, fulfilling Abraham's servant's prayer. Now, we don't see the element of compatibilism in this scene, but we do see it in another scene that I think is really powerful, which is the situation of Joseph revealing his identity to his brothers, and his brothers being upset and worried that they've done something evil and that Joseph is going to kill them. So this is in Genesis 45. Joseph tells his brothers, after he's revealed his identity to them, and after they break down and weep because they realize what evil they've done and they're afraid he's going to have them killed, he tells them, "Do not be distressed or angry with yourselves, because God sent me before you to preserve life." And he says later in Genesis 50, verse 20, this is the critical one, Joseph makes both his brothers and God the subject of the same verb, and their intended harm the direct object of that verb. So what he says is, you, my brothers, meant, and here the verb is chasav, chasav. So you meant, chasav, evil or calamity, ra'ah, against me. All right, so his Joseph's brothers are the subject of the verb intend or mean or plan, and the direct object of the verb is calamity or evil, ra'ah. But then he says God, so now God is the subject, same verb, chashav, meaning meant, and then the verb has a pronominal suffix in Hebrew, which tells you what the direct object is. And the direct object in this case is it, referring to that direct object of the previous use of the verb. The evil or the calamity that human beings, Joseph's brothers, meant or intended or planned for, or orchestrated, you could say, for Joseph. So here what you see is that we've got two different subjects of the exact same verb and the exact same direct object. And although chasav or chashav can express a variety of meanings in Scripture, when its direct object is ra'ah or calamity, that verb means something like devise or plan or orchestrate. You see this in Psalms 35:4 and 41:7 and 140 verse 2. You see it in Jeremiah 18:8 and 11, 48:2, and in Micah 2:3. So what Joseph is telling his brothers is they orchestrated, arranged, or planned calamity for Joseph, but God orchestrated or planned or intended that same calamity for good. So what we see here is that human beings are making choices. They are doing something with the intent that their actions would bring about calamity for Joseph. But what we also see is that God is equally involved in the orchestration of this evil for Joseph, this calamity for Joseph. God and human beings are both equally involved in the orchestration, the bringing about of this same intended thing. The only difference is their motives, or the difference is their motives and who's actually doing it. The brothers are the ones actually doing it, and their motives are for evil, but the motives of God, who is for ordaining and orchestrating their choice, is meant for good. And we see, later in Scripture, it's not as if they are told they've done nothing wrong. It's that they are it's that they are doing what they have been foreordained to do. So you see both the determinism and you see the human moral accountability. Now, last thing I'll say on this is just, and then we'll have some back and forth. But last thing I'll say on this is just that it's not as if these and other examples that I bring to bear in the book are sort of isolated occurrences. As if we see sometimes he operates in time, but he doesn't necessarily operate that way all the time. Well, we actually do see plenty of statements in Scripture that seem to indicate that that God precisely does do that, foreordain everything that takes place in time. So, for example, in Daniel 2:31-40, Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar that the motley statue in his prophetic dream symbolizes a series of subsequent kingdoms, and that it is God who removes kings and sets up kings. That's in verse 21. And then later in Daniel 4:25, Daniel tells Nebuchadnezzar that the Most High rules the kingdom of men and gives it to whomever he will. Job, in Job 12:18, says that God looses the bonds of kings and binds a waistcloth on their hips. He says in verse 19 that God leads priests away, stripped and overthrows the mighty. He says in verse 21 that God pours contempt on princes and loosens the belt of the strong. He says in verse 23 that God makes nations great and he destroys them. He enlarges nations and he leads them away. So you've got all this breadth of matters of human affairs in which God is orchestrating events. We also see in 1 Samuel 2:7-8, Hannah saying that the Lord makes poor and makes rich. He brings low and he exalts. He raises up from the poor and from the dust. He lifts the needy from the ash heap to make them sit with princes and inherit a seat of honor. In Ephesians 1:11, Paul says that God works all things according to the counsel of his will. And Romans 8:28, he says that God, for those who love God, all things work together for good. Psalm 139:16 says that in God's book were written every one of a person's days, the days that were formed for me, when as of yet there was none of them. James, in James 14, says that those who arrogantly assume their plans will be successful should instead say, if the Lord wills, we will live and do this or that. So we see this is just a sampling of the text, and there are others that we could bring to bear, which indicate that this way in which God works to sovereignly orchestrate affairs in time are not isolated examples. They are a reflection of how God operates through all of human history to bring about that which he has decreed. So yeah, I'll leave it at that. So just to summarize what I've said, we've got these examples like David and Abigail, Abraham and Sarah, Joseph and his brothers, that illustrate that God is sovereignly orchestrating all events in time to bring about what he has chosen to take place. And we see human beings being held accountable for even evil actions that God has foreordained to take place. And we see from a number of texts that this kind of sovereign, meticulous providence that God exercises is something that he exercises over all of time and not just certain incidents within time. So I'll leave it at that for now.
Excellent. All right. So, yeah, I think what I want to do now is I've sort of broken it up to let's kind of assess. So Chris has made his case on the Calvinist side for this meticulous providential design plan by God, and also the case for compatibilism. So I think the first place to start is, okay, let's look at this from a God's eye perspective, and in terms of God's knowledge. So in the first place, just as a yes or no, Chris, I take it you obviously believe God is omniscient.
Yes.
Excellent. Okay. So there are certain propositions that correspond to God's hypothetical knowledge. So, just by way of an example, 1 Corinthians chapter 2, verse 8, which says, "But the rulers of this world have not understood. If they had understood, they would not have crucified our glorious Lord." So there's this counterfactual statement whereby they wouldn't have killed Jesus if certain conditions were different or circumstances were different or something. So this is hypothetical knowledge where God knows what people would have done in a different circumstance or something like that.
Hmm.
And from my understanding, both Calvinists and Molinists affirm these Bible verses are true, but there is a difference in how they make sense of that in terms of the logical priority of when God had this hypothetical knowledge. Does it come after God's divine decree to create the universe, and therefore God is, well, yeah, I shouldn't explain it. So yeah, it's either logically prior to or it's logically posterior to God's divine decree to create. And just in the first place, Chris, I'll turn it to you as a Calvinist. How would you answer this? When, in terms of logical priority, when does God get this hypothetical knowledge?
Yeah, I mean, I question to what extent I would even be comfortable calling this hypothetical knowledge. I'm not saying I'm outright denying it, but I'm also not outright affirming it. And the reason is because of the way I perceive the relationship between God and His decree on the one hand, and human actions in time on the other hand. Most, I think, people naturally think about this in such a way as has human beings and God on sort of the same plane of existence in the same flow of time. So you have one agent that is God acting in time, and that brings about subsequent actions in time. But I don't believe that God is in time the same way we are. It doesn't necessarily mean I affirm divine timelessness, which a lot of philosophers dispute. But it does mean that I don't. If God experiences time by nature, I don't think that time is our time. I don't think that time is created time. It would be some another dimension, if you will, and I really don't think there's any way getting around that, because otherwise, time is as human time, which, as we know, is affected by things like gravity and by speed, the speed at which you're traveling. That time wouldn't be created. It would be every bit as eternal as God Himself. So I think that all of us have got to affirm that God is outside naturally of at least time that we experience. So I think of the relationship between God on the one hand and humans on the other hand more like the relationship between the author of a story, like the author of a novel, and the goings on inside of the story of that novel. The person who comes up with a story like that is on a completely different plane as the characters in the story that he thinks up. The entire storyline from start to finish is all at one instant in the mind of the author, at every instant of the author's time. And when things take place in that story, when characters in that story perform actions, it's not because the author is in time pulling strings and moving things around. When, for example, the author of when J.R.R. Tolkien writes, for example, that Smeagol is captured by Sauron's forces and is tortured, or actually I think this is probably Saruman's forces at this point, if I remember the story correctly. But anyway, I'm going a little nerd here, sorry.
No worries. I have no idea, so I wouldn't know. So.
Well, maybe some of your listeners will then. But when I'm referring to Lord of the Rings, but when J.R.R. Tolkien writes that Smeagol, otherwise known as Gollum, is captured by Sauron's or Saruman's forces and tortured and gives away the location of the ring in the Shire, J.R.R. Tolkien isn't in the story pulling strings that mechanistically cause the orcs or I think it's orcs who capture Smeagol and torture him until he gives up the location. It's not like that. J.R.R. Tolkien is outside of that world, and he decrees or ordains that will happen in the story. But completely different things bring about the capturing of Smeagol by the orcs, including the orcs' own decisions to do so. Now, how, if obviously analogies only go so far, they're all imperfect, but because this analogy captures this transcendent relationship of God to humans in a way that I don't think any other analogy does, then I look at things from that perspective and I ask, well, how does how does an author cause or bring about the events in the story to unfold? And my answer is I really don't know. He's not causing it in any ordinary use of the word cause that we would normally use, but it is perfectly foreordaining, and it guarantees that what takes place in the story does in fact take place. So going back to your question, if the relationship between God and humans is like the relationship between an author and a humans, author and then characters in the story, it's difficult to talk about hypothetical ability because the characters in a story don't do anything apart from the foreordaining decree of the author who writes the story. So the only way then that things would be other than they actually are if the author had written a different story. And likewise, the only way humans would do something different is if God had foreordained something different to happen. So I guess I could say that yes, there is this other hypothetical way things could happen, and it doesn't. And God can have knowledge of what those other things would be, but ultimately, those other ways, things that could be, are grounded in God's choice to not to write that story, and rather to write the story that He does write. And so that's how I would say that when we see biblical statements in which somebody says, if things had been different, then you would have done differently, I would say that the hypothetical knowledge is ultimately grounded on God's foreordaining decree rather than logically prior to it.
Just to sort of engage with discussion. So my understanding is, Chris, from the Calvinist perspective, Chris has described that right. So one thing to say though is I think the issue of time is irrelevant to this question. Whether you believe God's timeless in a hyper time like Chris was advocating for, or like me, I believe God is temporal in the same sense that we exist in. But it's a question. So it's not a question of chronological priority. It's logical priority or explanatory priority. So there are two options, as I said. So the Calvinists, from my understanding, will say what I think Chris was saying there, is that it's God's hypothetical knowledge, quote unquote hypothetical knowledge. And I know Chris objects to that terminology, but it's logically posterior to God's divine decree to create. So God is determining these counterfactual propositions and what they would be. Whereas for someone like me, a Molinist, who takes a Molinist perspective, we believe in what's called the doctrine of divine middle knowledge. And so the way to understand what that is, just to explain for the audience. So in the first place, God has what's called natural knowledge. Calvinists, Molinists, we all agree about this. And this is just God's logically prior to His decree to create the universe. He has knowledge of all necessary truths, all logically possible worlds, and the way things like a set of options that He can create that are all logically coherent worlds. And then after His decree, God has free knowledge. So that's His knowledge of his natural knowledge. A way to understand that is God knows what could be. And then with God's free knowledge, which comes after His decree to create, after He creates the actual world that we live in, this is His knowledge of what will be, because He's created the world and He has foreknowledge of what will take place. What Molinists do is they insert this middle category, hence why it's called middle knowledge. And this is God's hypothetical knowledge of what would be given a free creature's choice in any given set of circumstances. So this sort of reduces the number of logically possible worlds to what are called feasible worlds, based on people's libertarian free will to act this way or not, to reject God or not. And the middle knowledge under a Molinist scheme is logically prior to God's decree to create. And this is why it's not God determining what our free choices would be in any given set of circumstances. It's the other way around. And then God sovereignly foreordains in a strong sense. We'll get into that. I agree with Chris's notion of foreordination by sovereignly choosing which world to create in accordance with his nature. He chooses one of the best possible worlds or something to create. So that's sort of the fundamental difference that I'm getting at here, is that for a Molinist, God's hypothetical knowledge is logically prior to his decree of which world to create, whereas for Calvinists, it's logically posterior. It's after he chooses which world to create, and therefore God is actually determining or bringing in these counterfactual statements. Would you say that's sort of an accurate statement from your understanding there, Chris?
Yeah, I think so. The only thing that I would dispute is I don't think it's 100% true to say that the issue of time is irrelevant to this. I think I'm willing to agree with you that when it comes to this very, very specific question, the question of is God's knowledge of alternate possibilities logically prior to or posterior to his decision to create, I would agree that when it comes to that very precise question, the issue of time doesn't appear to be altogether relevant. But it will be relevant, as I think we'll see, when it comes to other questions in this debate. So I'll just wait to bring those comments in until we get there.
Okay, fair enough. So that's sort of a good, that sort of lays out the difference so the audience can understand what the different positions are. One thing I'd like to ask you about, or to sort of probe you on, is, so you sort of took issue with this notion of hypothetical knowledge, or William Lane Craig, for example, will call them counterfactuals of creaturely freedom. So they're a specific type of counterfactual. Would you, so in light of verses like 1 Corinthians 2:8 and that sort of thing, would you deny that there are counterfactuals of creaturely freedom?
Yeah, I don't think I would call them counterfactuals of human freedom, at least not freedom as William Lane Craig defines freedom. Remember, I'm a compatibilist, and so I think humans are free, but I think that their freedom is compatible with, and their accountability for that freedom is compatible with predeterminism, with determinism. So because God meticulously foreordains everything that takes place in time, the whatever alternate possibilities are not really alternate of or counterfactuals of human freedom. They're counterfactuals of arguably compatibilist freedom, which is not the kind of freedom William Lane Craig has in mind when he uses that word. But also it's a counterfactual of God's providence. Right? It's because ultimately God has chosen to foreordain A, that the counterfactual, not A, is only hypothetical. It's ultimately because God has chosen to foreordain A rather than not A. So I consider it to be more truly a counterfactual of divine sovereignty.
Okay, cool. And that sort of brings up the compatibilism angle, and I do think that is the I don't know how to say it. I was going to say escape route, but that
it's all right. I get it.
There you go. So yeah, just before we address that, I do want to get in, because part of your opening case dealt with the scriptural data on divine providence, and on this front, I because we're doing a probing interview, rather than focusing on specific verses and going into detail, we can look at sort of a broad summary and give people an idea of the various texts that are relevant to this question. So a Calvinist, D.A. Carson, I think, has been really helpful to me in understanding that there are various categories of biblical proof texts. So, for example, on the high end of divine sovereignty, there are four categories of texts that D.A. Carson mentions. So God alone is the creator and ruler and possessor of all things. An example of that would be Colossians 1:16 or something like that. God is also the ultimate personal cause of all that happens, and Chris gave us some good verses on that front. Thirdly, God elects and calls his chosen people for himself. So there's this notion of calling and election, that both Calvinists and Arminians fully endorse, though they have a different spin on what that means. And finally, fourthly, God is the source of all good fortune and success. So I think Chris mentioned things about the fates of the nations and Babylon and stuff like that. So this is all within God's sovereign control. And both me and Chris, as a Molinist, I would agree with Chris in having a strong view of sovereignty against something like open theism or something like that. And just before I get into the categories supporting human freedom, just for our any open theists in the audience, I'll just ask you quickly, Chris. There are some Bible verses, proof texts that open theists will try to use. So I think Jeremiah 19 or something, where the children of Israel are sacrificing their kids to Baal, and
Baal. Sorry.
Excuse me. Yeah. So it's and he says, God, and then God responds and he says, "Look, this is something I didn't intend. I didn't command it. It's something that's not even in. It wasn't even in my mind or something."
Yeah, it's Jeremiah 7:31.
Okay.
He says they have built the high places of Topheth, which is in the valley of the son of Hinnom, to burn their sons and their daughters in the fire, which I did not command, nor did it come into my mind.
So yeah, an open theist would use this and say, "Hey, you Molinists and Calvinists are both wrong. Look, this proves God doesn't have any knowledge of the future or something." Yeah, do you want to just give like a quick response to refute the open theism or respond to the open theism on the Bible stuff?
Yeah, the open theist's argument from texts like these treats the text in an extremely simplistic and wooden literalistic way. And not only that, but a very wooden literalistic way based on certain translations of the Hebrew. When you translate it the way the ESV does, nor did it come into my mind, then you treat that translation very wooden and literalistically to say God has this mind, this imagine concentric circles, and there's a circle representing all that God knows. And they're treating the word mind as synonymous with this circle that represents all that God knows, and them sacrificing sons and daughters in fire is outside of that concentric circle until it actually happens. Right? That's sort of the way that the open theist is arguing. But that's again an extremely wooden, literalistic interpretation of a particular English translation of the Hebrew text. The Hebrew is just an idiom. Meaning that God, it's like saying, not only did I not command you to do it, I didn't even think to command you of doing it. That's all he's saying. And so not an Arminian and not a Molinist and not a Calvinist thinks that God considered commanding these people to burn their sons and daughters in the fire. I think we Calvinists would even say that God doesn't, his prescriptive will, and if at some point you want to get into the distinction between different kinds of God's will, in his prescriptive will, we would say God doesn't even desire that these people burn their sons and daughters in the fire, even though he, outside of time, or at least outside of our time, perfectly foreordains that that's what they would in fact do. So it's if you look at how that Hebrew idiom is elsewhere used, it's not going to be any support for this idea that what he means by mind is the circle representing God's knowledge, and their choice beforehand to burn sons and daughters in fire is outside of that circle. That's just an extremely and illegitimately wooden literalistic interpretation of that English translation.
Perfect. So I obviously, as a Molinist, I fully agree with what Chris said. I'm not an open theist. I think that's the wrong interpretation. It's interpreting these things in a very wooden or literalistic way. That the Bible doesn't, that we're not meant to, kind of thing. So, okay. So on the other end, though, with Bible verses, there are Bible verses that Molinists or Arminians will use that stress humans as free moral agents. So we face so D.A. Carson categorizes it this way: we face texts that give us certain divine commands and exhortations to do or not do something. People are said to be to obey or believe and choose God and life, or to refrain from doing so. People obviously sin and rebel against God. Um, and God judges people for these sins. He holds them morally blameworthy, kind of thing, if they continue on in the sin, or he praises them if they repent and place their faith in God. There are verses saying people are tested by God. There's verses where I think 1 Corinthians 10:13 says God will not tempt us beyond what we as human beings are able to bear, and that sort of thing. So it kind of stresses it's on the human being to resist against this and that. And there are also the elect are responsible to respond to God's initiative. And also D.A. Carson mentions that prayers, they're not just showpieces that would seem to be dictated or determined by God, like some kind of script with the author and the characters just saying what they've been scripted to say and that sort of thing. There's this notion of the confluency of Scripture, which recognized there was a real human agency in the writing of God's words. There are verses where God, he pleads with people. So this is kind of an exhortation, but he's pleading with sinners to repent and be saved. And then finally, God grieves, or he even repents of certain things based on the response of human agents. So he'll say, I'm going to destroy you, but if you repent, I'll, like the Jonah and Assyria story and that sort of thing. So he in a way, kind of reacts, narratively speaking, in response to how humans respond to his judgments or prophecies and that. So I know that's sort of a lot of categories, but yeah. Do you want to maybe give, at least on some of them, give like an overall take? Why are Molinists or Arminians wrong to take these verses at face value and say, yeah, we really are free moral agents, and the Bible seems to teach that?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think that you're wrong to take it that way, because I think that we're free moral agents as well. The question is, in whose view is is it in both, in one or in none of these competing views? Is that kind of moral accountability feasible? Right, that's the real question, and my view would be that all of them make it possible. I actually think that the view I've here been defending is more consistent with prayer. So I'll get to that last. But when it comes to other things, the other things that you mentioned, this is where again I think that the analogy of an author and the characters in the novel is apt, because if you have an author who writes a story, first of all, authors will very often tell you that they experience a great deal of emotional pain and grief when they write things that take place in their story. Now, that doesn't mean that they were forced to write that story against their will. No, they wrote the story that they felt was the right story to tell, whatever that means to them. And yet they will grieve the actions of characters and the fates of characters in that story. So likewise, I think that God can foreordain this everlasting story that begins with creation and it never ends. He can foreordain that everlasting story and everything that takes place in it. And he can foreordain that people do things that grieve him, and that things happen to people that grieves him. And that doesn't mean that it's all a sham. At least I don't think it does. It just means that God has an overriding concern. It means the author has an overriding concern, even though he would rather his protagonist or her protagonist not violently die in the story. And even though the author would prefer emotionally and in terms of what's right and wrong that an antagonist not perform the actions that an antagonist does in the story, nevertheless, the author has overriding concerns for what he or the author wants to have happen. And want here is a bit of a different meaning than want as in my emotional desire and my moral desires that people do this or don't that. Want is something of a different category here. And so then the question becomes, well, why would God foreordain? Why would an author write a story in which things happen and people do things that grieve the author? And that's a question you have to ask the author. It's a question we have to ask God, in my view. And I think I have speculative answers, but they are almost entirely speculations. And I think that's all we can do, is speculate as to why God might want people to do evil things in time, and why he might foreordain that evil things happen to people in time that he would otherwise prefer not happen to him. And we could talk about that if you want, but that's the point I'm getting at, is that I think that human beings can genuinely be said to make certain choices in a story, evil ones, and evil things can befall them, and all of that can grieve the author, in this case God, even though it has nevertheless been foreordained to happen just the way that it has. Now, as for prayer, what I will say is this: I can't understand how, at least in a non-Molinistic Arminianism, how, or for that matter, open theism, how prayer typically is going to make any difference whatsoever. And the reason I say that is because most of our prayers, in order to be fulfilled, do in fact require the countless actions of human agency in time. So let me give you an example. I remember when I was a kid, here's an example. I, a number of years ago, was playing flag football, and one of the opponents on the other team was a former collegiate linesman. And I was the strongest guy on my team, not because I'm big, but it's because I, at the time, was a competitive powerlifter. And so I took on this linesman as a linesman myself. And at one point, he had the ball, and I ran up to him, and I went to go grab, I extended my hands out in front of me to grab the flags from his belt and pull them down. But my pinky on my left hand hit this giant of a man, this guy who was a collegiate linesman, and fractured. And from the second knuckle from the end of the tip, from that point onward, it was bent at like a 45-degree angle. Now, as it turns out, I just had one of my friends who was there drive me to the hospital, and it was all taken care of. But let's say that nobody was driving there, and I'm like, oh God, please let somebody get me to the hospital somehow. All right. And let's say that right as I'm done praying that prayer, like Abraham's servant prayed at the well of Nahor, that God would reveal who Isaac should be married to. In the same way, I'm praying, God, please let me get to the hospital somehow. And all of a sudden, an ambulance just happens to show up because somebody else at the same location got injured and called an ambulance. All right. And fortunately, there's enough room in this ambulance, or maybe a fire truck came with it. And so they've got enough room to take both of us to the hospital. And I'm like, praise God. God answered my prayers. Think about how many countless acts of human history, of human agency, had to work to take place in just the way they did for that prayer to be answered in the way that it did. Not only did somebody else have to get injured at the same time to prompt them to call the fire department or the ambulance, but they also had to happen to have cell phones on them and cellular coverage, and their call would have had to have gone through, and the firemen and the ambulance drivers would have had to have driven at exactly the right rate to drive at the rate they did, to arrive when they did. And the lights on the way, the street lights, would have had to have kept traffic in such a way that those people could get there. And even if you want to say, well, yeah, but they turn their lights off or turn their lights on, and so the lights all turn red. Well, you still have to say that people were driving safely enough that there weren't any blocking accidents along the way. There would have to be no natural disasters along the way that would have diverted them from getting there on time. The people that are driving them would have had to have made the right turns at the right times. On and on it goes. There's really almost no end to the human choices and natural occurrences that had to take place in exactly the way they did to get the ambulance and the fire truck there at exactly the time they did in order to answer your prayer. I think that virtually every prayer that we pray likewise involves an innumerable number of human acts of agency for that prayer to be answered. And I don't see how in Arminianism or open theism that is possible. Molinism kind of might be arguably able to escape this dilemma, because God knew in all of these myriad possible worlds that in one of these worlds the person would pray what they did, and that all these things would take place in just the right time, et cetera, et cetera. And he chose to actuate that world for any number of reasons that he had, and so that one becomes the one world that does obtain. Whether or not that explanation sort of escapes this dilemma, I'll leave up to the listener. But the reason why I think that Calvinism and this view of providence that I've articulated best accounts for prayer being meaningful and actual is because God can foreordain that the prayer you pray is the prayer you pray, and that because of the prayer you pray, he logically logically on that prayer that he foreordains that the fire truck and the ambulance would get there when they do. Now, granted, this is from our perspective retroactive, right? We're praying after the effect that an event would obtain that required innumerable previous events in time, and so it's backwards in time that our fulfillment of our prayer is actually secured. But nevertheless, logically, that prayer is effectual because God has foreordained that you pray what you pray, and that as a result, what you prayed would happen. He just orchestrates everything in timeless eternity to work out the way that he foreordained you would pray that they work out. So as difficult as that is to get our minds around, nevertheless, I think, at least at this point, I'm convinced that is the way, that is the view of freedom and time that makes prayer most meaningful as compared to the other views in which I don't think prayer can be as effectual. Think of the prayer that somebody would be saved, right? If God is trying to save everybody equally, if God equally wants every single human being who has ever lived to be saved, then when I pray for, say, when I prayed for a few years after becoming a believer that my wife would be saved, what am I praying God would do? If he answers that prayer in any way, then he's not, in fact, willing my wife's salvation as more, or he's not willing her salvation equally as much as he wills everybody else's salvation, because he's working in time to bring about, in a special way, her salvation if he answers my prayer in any way. But in Calvinism, in the view of providence I've articulated, God can, remember, what God decrees is obtained in time by secondary causes that secondary to him being the first cause of those things taking place. And one of these secondary causes, or these secondary means by which God brings about the salvation that he has foreordained, can be your very prayer, my very prayer for my loved one. It just would work retroactively, arguably, because of all these series of human actions that would have had to have taken place in time to make that happen. So again, I think prayer is most meaningful and can most be effectual in a Calvinistic meticulous providence view than in these other views.
All right, cool. Yeah, I think that gives the Calvinist side, and Chris also kind of answered how the Molinist would make sense of these texts as well. It's through his divine middle knowledge. He chooses which world to actualize as a sovereign creator. It's through his election, and through his goals will totally be achieved through history, through all the various cause and effect, causal chains, and that sort of thing. And at the same time, it also affirms libertarian free will. So Chris has mentioned compatibilism several times. We will get into a compare and contrast of the libertarian free will versus compatibilism in a bit. But yeah, first I just wanted to allow the audience to get familiar with, well, these are how the different approaches of how a Molinist will reconcile these texts versus a Calvinist will reconcile these texts. Neither one of us denies the truth of these biblical texts. It's how we interpret or reconcile them to make sense in some kind of a systematic doctrine there. One question for you, just on a very base level, and you've kind of already answered it, but again, as a theological objection, most people listening to what you're saying with this cause and effect and determinism, the simplest objection is, look, reality is a farce. We are just robots. We're not agents. We're just puppets. We're like a toy soldier where God is making me do this or that. How can that make sense for God to blame me for sinning when he's the one, moving my toy arm to poke my sister in the, poke my sister or something, or slap her or something like that. That's God. That's God. He's the one forcing me to do that. I'm just a puppet. I shouldn't be blamed. So, yeah, just that's sort of a simple objection. What do you make of that?
Yeah, so I mean, most of the analogies I would say all of the analogies I've ever heard a critic of this view of providence offer, they're all fundamentally flawed analogies, and that includes the one that you just gave. So you gave the analogy of of God pushing my arm and making it hit my sister or whatever, but notice that there's a really big problem with that. There are at least two big problems with that analogy. One is you're not making any choice. Your arm is moving independently of your will. Right? And that's not what meticulous providence says. The other and arguably more foundational flaw in the analogy is that God is a mover in time with you, who is also in the same flow of time. But that too is a fundamentally flawed view of the relationship between God and humans in time from a compatibilist perspective. And the same is true of all the other analogies I've heard when it comes to puppets, for example. The marionette is in time, in the same stream of time, with the puppet pulling those strings, and those strings are mechanistically causing the limbs at the end of those strings to move in the way that the marionette dictates they move. But in the relationship between God and humans in compatibilism, God is not in time pulling strings or pushing levers or anything like that in order to make somebody do something. It's why I really kind of wince when I hear people say that in my view God is making or forcing or causing somebody to do something, because all of those words imply this in time chain of cause and effect events that our view just doesn't have. Take robots. Here's another example. Robots or computer programs or whatever. These are, again, responding mechanistically to programming that is not only executing in time, but was also written in time. And so you've got, again, the writer, the programmer of the code, and the robot or the computer or the program character in software mechanistically reacting to programming that was done in time, and the mechanistic cause and effect chain of the programming to the effect is also likewise happening in time. And on top of all that, again, you don't have a conscious being making decisions. All you've got are the mechanistic results of prior causes. So all of these analogies fail to account, fundamentally fail, because they fail to account for this transcendent relationship between God and created time. So here's how I would try to help people see why the analogy is fundamentally flawed. In a story, again, a novel written by an author, let's say that in the story you've got a character who's a marionette, and you've got a figure in the story that is a marionette's puppet. And in the story that this author has written, the marionette pulls one of the strings, and the puppet's arm moves mechanistically as a result of the marionette pulling the string. In this analogy, you do have the kind of blind automaton type of agent, non-agent, you would say, in the story, namely the puppet. That puppet is not conscious, is not sentient, is not making any choices. It's simply reacting mechanistically to the actions of the marionette. But the marionette is not mechanistically reacting to causes and effects in the time of the story. And the marionette is not a non-agent. It's not a non-conscious, non-sentient non-agent. It's a conscious, sentient agent making a choice to pull the strings of the puppeteer, or the strings at the end of which the puppet's arms are attached. So in this one single story, perfectly and irresistibly, if you will, authored by the author, Both of these two figures in the story are irresistibly carrying out what the author has foreordained. But only one of them is analogous to a puppet or a robot, or to the kid whose arm is being pushed by somebody into his sister's body. And that's the puppet. The marionette isn't analogous to that. There's no mechanistic series of physical causes and events, a chain of them at the end of which is irresistibly this pulling of the string that causes the marionette's arm to move. No. We don't know how the relationship, we don't know how that choice on the part of the marionette obtains in the time of the story, in terms of how that is guaranteed to happen because of the story, because of the author of the story. We just know that it does. And in the same way, I think that in real life, a marionette and a puppet are both irresistibly carrying out what God has foreordained to take place. But only one of them is in any way, shape, or form analogous to a puppet or a robot, and that's the non-sentient, non-agent whose actions are the mechanistic results of cause and effect chains in time. The other person is in no way analogous to that kind of thing, and that's why I don't think that the objection holds up under scrutiny.
Gotcha. Yeah. And, so. For my part, I will agree with Chris that there are relevant disanalogies here, and ultimately I reject it. It's contingent on there's this compatibilism view, but we'll get into that in the next section. We're going to really assess those differences because ultimately I do think it does reduce down to being a toy soldier or a puppet, but there are these relevant differences to note here. It's not just this simplistic, oh, you just believe we're a robot or a puppet, and that there's there's nuance here that needs to be known. But before we move on to that, Chris, I do want to get, so this isn't a part of what we prepare, but I am fascinated by your disanalogy based on temporality. Okay, so do you mind if I just ask, I still don't see why this is relevant. So sure, under your view, if you believe God is in a hyper time, let's just say that's for the sake of argument, that's true, and that compatibilism is true. So all the factors for God to determine these things are present. It flows through the right causal chain and that sort of thing. Why does the fact that God isn't in our time, like I don't see, so that's a disanalogy with the toy soldier, but it's not a relevant one. Like, why, if all the conditions are present under your view to determine someone's action, whether God is within our time or in a hyper time, he's still pulling the lever. So I just don't see why the temporality matters. Does that make sense? Yeah.
Oh, yeah, it does make sense. The question makes sense, but it presumes the very flaw that I pointed out. Because notice you said the conditions still obtain, the cause and effect chain obtains in time that necessarily brings about the decision. But that's precisely what I'm denying is true of the relationship between God and human agents in time. There is no set of conditions in time, no cause and effect chain of events, of cause and event in time that necessarily brings about the choice that any particular agent makes. Going back to my example of the author of a story, the author may never put down pen to paper. The author may never even visualize in his or her own mind the story unfolding in the story that the author has created. The author has in mind the story that exists in the author's mind, and of course here the analogy falls down a bit because created time is an actual entity. It's not merely a mental fiction. So the analogy does break down, but the point of the analogy is to show that in this transcendent relationship between author and story, there is no conditions in time or chain of events in the storyline that necessarily brings about a character's action. The relationship simply is the author foreordains what will happen in the story, and the characters in the story play out that foreordained action. We don't know what we may never, going back to the analogy I gave earlier of Smeagol, we may not have any idea why in J.R.R. Tolkien's story Smeagol decided to be where he was when the orcs captured him and took him to be tortured so that they could find out where the ring was. We may not have any idea why. It may not have anything to do with the particular circumstances of that day, or any series of chain of causes and effects. Smeagol may simply wake up in some particular location and say, you know what, I think I'm going to go walk a mile over this direction, and he does, and boom, the orcs are there and capture him. I don't remember how the story exactly takes place, but the point I'm getting at is what brought about the reality that that Smeagol would be in the right place at the right time to be captured by the orcs and then taken and tortured. What brings that about is utterly unknown to us. And as the readers of that story, we have no idea whether there was some sort of, we don't know if Smeagol was caused by hunger, which was caused by having not eaten, which is caused by him having gone to bed early the night before, which was caused by him not having had large enough meal or whatever. We don't know what chain of events might have led up to that. We don't know what conditions obtained that prompted him to do that. All we know is J.R.R. Tolkien wrote it and Smeagol did it. And that's the relationship I see between God and human agents in time. God perfectly foreordains that an agent A will do action E in time. And as it turns out, because God has foreordained that, agent A does in fact do action E or event E in time. But we have no way of knowing whether it was a chain of causes and effects that irresistibly resulted in him doing that. And we don't know if it has to do with the particular circumstances and conditions in which A finds him or herself at that time. All we know is God foreordained it and the agent did it. So that's why all of these analogies do in fact fail at the fundamental level, because they all assume, every single one of them, that an agent or an alleged agent's action in time is simply the irresistible, inevitable result of the conditions in which he or she finds him or herself, and the chain of causes and effects leading up to that point. And those are not things that compatibilism entails. And the other thing I'll just add is this: if it were true that in my analogy I offer, the analogy of an author and his or her novel, if it were true that that analogy doesn't ultimately solve the problem, then there should be no reason whatsoever why critics of my view wouldn't be comfortable just using the analogy I've just offered. If it were no problem, I mean, if my analogy doesn't solve the ultimate objection, then my critics should lovingly and gleefully embrace the analogy that I've offered, because they would presumably be able to still offer the exact same objection and say to me, yeah, but if the characters are nevertheless doing what they've been written to do or been authored by the author to do, they're still doing what is inevitable. And yet, even though they will make that claim, they never shift to using the analogy that best reflects what we compatibilists actually believe. And that leads me to suspect, not assume, but suspect that my analogy does in fact escape the objection, because if it didn't, then I think people like Leighton Flowers would gleefully embrace this analogy, and they've yet to do so.
Interesting. Okay. Yeah. Cool. Yeah. It's. I'm still a little. I just wanted to ask that. I'm still a little iffy. I'm gonna go back.
That's
and
okay.
I'm good using the analogy. For me, what's important is what is explanatorily or logically prior, not, and that doesn't assume a temporal succession or something like that. That, obviously we both agree that God is the author. He's determining what these people would do. His will, or he's the first mover, so he is ultimately responsible for determining what these people are doing within time. But yeah, all right, cool. That's something that I need to think about. Your example. So, all right, well, let's get into this. We've been sort of dancing around this, compatibilism versus libertarian free will. That is really the fundamental distinction between us on this issue of providence here. So, in the first place, I just want to sort of turn it to you. So there are 5 fundamental conditions or features that distinguish libertarian free will from compatibilism. So these are, number 1, the ability condition. Number 2, there's the control condition. Number 3, there's the rationality condition. And then there's the issue of causation. Chris has kind of hinted at that a bit. And there's also the issue of the person as the agent, which Chris has sort of hinted at his answer, which is not standard for compatibilists. So that's interesting. But yeah, before I say anything, Chris, I'll just turn it to you. And why don't you just give us sort of a summary, your opening statement in terms of what's your position on these five contrasting features as a Calvinist?
Well, so first of all, let me say I'm not aware, I'm not educated in philosophy except for one intro to philosophy class I took in my undergrad, which, by the way, I did very well in. So evidently I can do decent philosophy. I just, I'm not a professional. So what I'm about to say may be untrue, but it seems to me as if this is not like some sort of agreed upon list of five conditions that philosophers across the board agree with. As far as I can tell, this is a specific list of five differences that are alleged to exist between libertarianism and compatibilism in a book written by J.P. Moreland and William Lane Craig called Philosophical Foundations for a Christian Worldview. Now, that doesn't mean that they're wrong or anything. It just means when I initially read the question that you told me you were going to ask me, I was like, what? I've never heard of these five conditions. And it wasn't until I did a little bit of searching that I found that this book is where those five things are laid out. Now, and for readers that are interested, if you check out the book, it's in chapter 15, which is called Free Will and Determinism. And halfway through or toward the end of that chapter, they've got this table where they allege to distinguish between libertarian free will and compatibilist free will by how those two views answer each of these five issues. Now, I don't dispute that these are, in fact, five legitimate ways or differences between libertarianism and compatibilism, but I do dispute that all of them are accurate categorizations. I think some of them are, but even those that are, I think, are for the wrong reasons. So let me go. I'll give you three examples, and then you can certainly probe me at further length. So one of those you mentioned was the ability condition, and this is the ability condition is what Moreland and Craig claim is the idea that human beings have a categorical two-way ability to choose this or that in libertarian free will, which means that in any given decision, humans can genuinely or categorically choose A or not A. So that's why they come up with this phrase, categorical two-way ability. But then they go on to claim that in compatibilism, human beings only have hypothetical one-way ability because they can't really choose either A or not A, but they are instead forced by previous causes to choose one, while hypothetical conditions that don't actually obtain would have instead forced a different choice. So it's hypothetical and it's one way in their view. Now, I will accept that compatibilism does indeed entail a hypothetical one-way ability for human beings, but not for the reasons that Moreland and Craig offer. They write that in compatibilism, quote, given a description of a person's circumstances and internal states at time, only one choice could obtain, and the ability to refrain simply is not there. Its presence depends on the hypothetical condition that the person had a desire that was not actually present, unquote. Now, that's simply untrue. It's not true that in compatibilism, conditions that obtain in time predetermine human actions. No. In compatibilism, it's the foreordaining decree of God outside of created time, which guarantees that human actions obtain in time. So the ability is indeed hypothetical, and it's one way, but the hypothetical condition under which a person might have chosen other than one did isn't some condition or cause and effect chain in time. It's rather the condition that God foreordained something other than he did in fact foreordain outside of created time. Nothing in time is actually forcing anybody's hand. So that's why, although I will grant their way of describing compatibilism as hypothetical one-way ability, nevertheless, the hypothetical condition is not something in time and is not some sort of series of cause and events in time like they claim. Now,
God's decree is what you're saying.
Yes, outside of time, not pulling any strings in time. There's no mechanistic cause and effect relationship here, as there are in all the analogies that Moreland and Craig even use in their book. Now, that might seem like a minor critique, and that's fine, but I think the problems get worse. So let's turn to the control condition. Moreland and Craig say that the control condition is the notion that freedom requires that one, quote, must be in control of, unquote, the actions that one takes, and that libertarianism entails that human beings are the first or unmoved movers of their choices. And to explain what they mean, they offer one of these analogies I've been talking about. They offer an analogy in which the first car in a densely packed line of cars bumps into the next car in the line, which thereby is mechanistically caused to bump into the next car, and so on and so forth down through the line. Only the first car in this analogy is an unmoved mover. All the other cars are just sort of passively receiving the motion and transferring it. By contrast, Moreland and Craig argue that in compatibilism, humans are merely passive recipients through whom the movement of past action is transferred to subsequent action, kind of like those other cars in the analogy. So, and because of that, Moreland and Craig call this a causal theory of action. So again, on this control condition, Moreland and Craig claim that libertarianism has human beings being first or unmoved movers, whereas compatibilists compatibilism entails a causal theory of action. Excuse me. But this again is mistaken. Moreland and Craig's categorization depends on their claim that in compatibilism, quote, cause and effect is to be depicted as a series of events making up causal chains with earlier events together with the laws of nature causing later events, unquote. Now, this is a fantastic definition of one kind of determinism, namely materialistic atheistic determinism. But it is not at all true of theistic determinism. God's foreordaining decree outside of time does indeed predetermine human choices, but those choices aren't the inevitable mechanistic result of a chain of events in time and space stretching back to the beginning of time, as Moreland and Craig claim it is. And so this is why I deny the accusation that I believe in causal determinism, because God isn't in time causing choices like dominoes in a line or puppets on strings. So I do think that Moreland and Craig's categorization here is mistaken. It's true that our view of causation, or the control condition, as they put it, is different in our view than in libertarianism. But it's not because humans are moved by some external agent or previous set of conditions like a car and a line of cars. Even if we can't explain how what God foreordains outside of time guarantees that people do in time what he has decreed, it doesn't follow that therefore it's an unbroken line of causes and effects in time that just operates mechanistically by cause and effect. So their categorization there, I think, does indeed fail. One other example I'll offer, and then you grill me all you want, is the category of causation. So Moreland and Craig categorize libertarianism and compatibilism based on causation. They say that in libertarianism, humans exercise agent causation or non-causal agency, meaning that human beings are agents who are causes of effects, but are not themselves the effects of previous causes. By contrast, Moreland and Craig claim that compatibilism entails only event-event causation, meaning every event in time, including human choices, is itself the effect of previous events that cause it, kind of like those other cars in the earlier analogy. But here again, Moreland and Craig are mistaken. Compatibilism does not entail that events are simply the effects of previous events that cause them. Again, we can't explain, we theistic determinists, we can't explain how God's foreordaining decree outside of time guarantees that people do in time what he has decreed. But the fact that we can't explain that doesn't mean that the only possible explanation is that events in time are merely the mechanistic effects of previous events in time that caused them. And so, no, I don't think it's true, as Moreland and Craig claim, that in compatibilism you have only event causation and no agent causation. It's just a mistaken categorization. Now, I haven't looked as closely into the other two, but I'd be happy for you to push back on any of them. But that's what I would say, is that this way of that Moreland and Craig distinguish between these two views based on these five differences is they're right to say that we differ in how we answer each of these things, but they're wrong very often in the way that they characterize compatibilists as answering those questions.
I'll say this just to back up what Chris is saying. Yeah, so in terms of William Lane Craig and J.P. Moreland's take, they're obviously having in mind, it's an introduction to philosophy text, right? And they have in mind the typical material atheistic determinist. So Chris, as a Calvinist, has a nuanced take on that, in that no, God is actually the condition, that the ultimate condition in that, and he's an agent. So it's not pure event causation like an atheism would predict or something. So that's a good point. I'm glad that came out, and I want to say thank you so much for going into that level of research. That was really helpful and that sort of thing. So,
Well, I thought it was a great question, and I was really interested in learning about this way. I'd be interested. Do you know if there are other philosophers who offer these same five things, or is this, as far as you know, particular to Moreland and Craig?
there are other philosophers that I've seen that have written on parts of it. So, for example, when I was at Ryerson, my own professor mentioned
Okay,
some of these things. But yeah, they're the only ones that I've seen that have put all five of these things together in the format that they do. But
gotcha.
okay, so in terms of the ability condition, so I hear you. So you do recognize, you do deny that we don't have this dual ability. We just have this hypothetical ability, and it's hypothetical on the condition that God's will, as opposed to temporal material causes and effects or something, are different.
Yeah, I don't deny that. Although I am reluctant to fully embrace that language only because the word ability is such a it has such a wide semantic range. No, here's an example of what I mean by that. I have the ability as a sometimes power lifter to bench a certain amount of weight that a lot of other people can't. I've got you might call this capacity maybe or capability. But if I believe, and I do, that God has foreordained that I fail to lift that weight in a competition, even though I've got the muscular strength, the muscular capability to do it, if you want to use the word ability to describe the fact that what God has perfectly foreordained to happen will in fact happen, and that it's not possible for any other thing to happen. If you want to use the word ability to describe that, that's fine. And to the extent that that word applies, yes, I don't deny that humans only have this sort of one-way hypothetical ability, as Moreland and Craig put it. But again, ability equally sounds to me like the kind of word that would describe somebody who has the muscular capacity, like me, to be able to lift a very heavy weight in a bench press in a competition. And so I get a little frustrated when this issue of ability comes up, because for me, it's really not about ability in that second way I described. It's not like somebody doesn't have the capacity or capability to not do what they do. It's just that God's foreordaining decree is perfect and irresistible in the sense that what he has foreordained will, no matter what, inevitably happen the way that he has foreordained it to happen. And I'm reluctant to fully embrace the idea that to call the fact that we will not do other than what has been foreordained, to call that inability is in my mind a bit wishy-washy. It's a bit flimsy. That doesn't sound like ability to me. And that's why I'm a little bit reluctant. But to the extent, again, that ability refers to whether it's metaphysically possible for an agent to do other than what God has foreordained, I'm comfortable saying that we only have hypothetical one-way ability.
Okay, interesting. Yep, and yeah, Chris already gave the contrast. So Molinists will say, no, we have this dual ability. However, we would agree with Chris in what he's saying, in that once God has decreed which world to create, things will. He's a sovereign God. It will go exactly according to his plan, and it's just in the choosing. This is why that first question about when. The doctrine of divine middle knowledge. God chooses which world to create, and it's based on his middle knowledge of what each free creature would do in any given set of circumstances, and then God chooses to actualize this actual world, this set of circumstances, and that sort of thing. So that's sort of the fundamental difference there.
Well, but just to be clear, even in the way that you just put it, subsequent temporally and logically to God's choice to actualize the one world that he decides to actualize in Molinism, subsequent to that, in the world that he did create, you and I have the same equally hypothetical one-way ability as I think human beings do. Right? Because once God actualizes the one world in which he chooses, the one world he chooses to actualize, then everything that takes place in time will come to pass exactly as he knew it would, and there is no metaphysical ability for somebody to do other than what he knew they would do in the world in which the world he actually chose to actualize. So yes, I would agree with you that at the moment, and speaking temporally is a little bit difficult when we talk about transcendence, but at that moment that God decides which world to actualize, any given agent could have done anything, not A or not A. Although even there, I would question to what extent an agent is the actual same agent in each of these different worlds. But we can put that philosophical thing aside because then our minds are going to really hurt. But but once he makes that decision, choices or ability is every bit as hypothetical in one way as it is in mine. You would agree, right?
No, I would disagree with that. So we do have this categorical ability to do, or this metaphysically possibility to do or not to do. It's I guess put it this way. We wouldn't do that. We wouldn't choose differently than what we do, given God created this. But it's not externally determined by God or a physical set of circumstances and cause and effects. It's internally, given my free will. I'm the ultimate reason why I don't choose that way, but I do have that ability to.
Well, but that's not the ability condition. That's either the control condition or causation. When it comes to ability condition, remember, I think that human beings have the ability to choose to do other than they do, defined as the capacity or the capability to make a particular choice at a particular point in time. It's only understanding ability in this more metaphysical sense that human beings don't have the ability to do other than they do. And that's equally true in a Molinistic scheme, because in a Molinistic view, once God has decided which world to create, then seconds before, minutes before, years before, centuries and millennia before I choose to do something, God perfectly knows that that's what's going to happen, and I have no metaphysical ability to do other than I do. It's just prior to that moment of deciding which world to actualize that arguably an agent could do any number of things. But again, I think you start to fall back on this problem of saying that I am actually me in every one of these hypothetical worlds before the moment of actualization. Yeah. But if we have to agree to disagree on that, that's fine. I just think that what you're highlighting there is not the ability condition. You're highlighting control or causation.
They are interrelated. Yeah, but I do think it is. Yeah, so if you want to just include the fact that our cells, our internal, we're determined internally given these set of external conditions, then yeah, but it's not this external force that is, once God creates these circumstances, knowing in advance what we would do in each thing, it's all determined from there. That's the part that I'm pushing back on. So, I get what you're saying there.
And this is why I say that I think you're describing the control condition, because it's in the control condition that Moreland and Craig say that compatibilists believe in event-event causation, causal theory of action, whereas in libertarianism they claim that human beings are the first or unmoved movers. So it's under this condition that Moreland and Craig are saying that it's not something external to you that is determining what you do. You are the first in that line of cars. But that's not the ability condition, as far as I can tell. The ability condition is whether or not it's actually categorically possible at a moment in time that an agent could choose A or not A. And it's in that case that I think you and I are in the same boat, because once God has chosen to actualize one of these possible worlds, then by the time it reaches your moment to choose between A and not A, God already knows what you're going to choose, and there's no metaphysical ability for you to do otherwise.
Just before we get into the control condition, though, I did have one question. And since you've read William Lane Craig, I know that you'll be their chapter on that. You will be aware of this. But with the ability condition, are you familiar with Benjamin Libet's experiments in neuroscience? Where, are you familiar with that, first of all? Or?
Only very little, and I don't think I'd be able to speak to it with any degree of authority. But I'd be happy for you to explain the experiments to me.
Gotcha. Okay, so basically what he did is so determinists like him because, number one, he sort of did experiments where he proved that there is this brain activity, this state, this readiness potential is what he called it, and this occurred certain milliseconds, 550 milliseconds prior to the subject's awareness that they want to make their choice, raise their finger, or whatever it was in the experiment. However, so that's sort of supports determinism, physical determinism, and that sort of thing. But he also found later on, what I wanted to sort of ask you about was, he also discovered, so he contradicted himself, because he found out that there was this, what he called a free want phenomenon. So this relates to the dual ability, the ability to refrain. So even after that readiness potential went up and they became aware of their intention to raise their finger, about 330 milliseconds before they did it, they had this free want phenomenon where they could veto their decision and refrain from not raising it. So I just wanted to, because you're not familiar with it, it's not fair to ask, but based on what I've said, if that's true, do you think that has any play, or how would you reconcile that? Wouldn't that be a dual ability then, or suggestive of that, or yeah?
I think it would work as an excellent, possibly. I mean, you know the details of this better than I do, but it sounds to me like it would be an excellent refutation of materialistic determinism. But I can't conceive of any way in which it's a objection to theistic determinism, because again, theistic determinism does not entail that our choices are the mechanistic results of previous causes and effects. So I'm looking at the graph, a sort of simple chart on it's figure 15.1 in the book, where they've got a line. It says RP, which I think is referring to that readiness that you were talking about. And then 350 milliseconds later, there's the intention. And then 200 milliseconds later, there's the actual muscle activity. And it sounds like what you're saying is even prior to this readiness, or very shortly thereafter, there's this veto power, this free want that humans have that allows them to refrain from acting despite this readiness potential that was there milliseconds before. And because, as I've explained, compatibilism, at least in a theistic determinism, does not assume that somebody's choices are the mechanistic, inevitable causes of previous mental activity, brain activity. So in my theistic determinism, this free want moment of whereby a person has the power to refrain from acting despite prior brain activity, that's equally consistent in theistic determinism and compatibilism, because we don't know how what God foreordains outside of time is guaranteed to take place in time. So humans, yes, we believe humans have an agency, and they make the choice that may or may not cohere with previous brain activity. But all that refutes is the idea that choice is the inevitable result of previous causes and effects in time. But in no way does that challenge the compatibilism that I've been here representing.
Awesome. Yeah, so I'm just going to back up Chris. He's absolutely right on. So I think what he just said is true. That I don't think the Benjamin Libet experiments can be used to rule out this kind of theistic determinism, or a theistic notion of ability necessarily. So, yeah, well said. I'll agree with you on that, actually.
Thanks.
No worries. No, that's about truth. So, okay, so now we've sort of been hinting at this all-important control condition, and again, I think you've kind of laid out both sides perfectly. So you've done my work for me, but just to sort of illustrate, to help the audience understand, well, what does it mean for a free person to make a choice that's under their control? And one of the examples, I think William Lane Craig gives it, but there's this issue of dominoes, right? So you can picture two sets of domino lines. One line is just all black dominoes. The other line would be the compatibilist line. So there's black dominoes, but then there's some green dominoes in the sequence. The green dominoes represent the proper internal states. So, like beliefs, desires, and all of that. Either way, so when that first mover flicks that thing, when God flicks the first set of dominoes under, a set of like natural cause and effects, the black dominoes go down. None of the dominoes have a choice to fall. It's not under their control when they're falling. I think it's the same thing when we're saying, well, if God flicks the set with some green dominoes in it, even though those dominoes are painted green, they still don't have any real control over whether they're falling. And I think that the same issue would apply in Chris's case under a theistic determinism thing. If it's so, it's not the prior black dominoes knocking over the green things. It's God is kind of inputting and flicking those green ones down as the black ones fall. So it would still make control kind of illusory. That's really not control, or it's objectionable. So whereas
Yeah, I mean, if yeah,
sorry.
I'll just say I agree that if that were an accurate analogy, then it would make causation there illusory. I mean, it would make agency illusory. But of course, I don't think that that's an apt analogy.
Okay, so how do you so you think that the green domino, so like libertarian free will, it would be the domino sets, and then those dominoes can, each domino, when it's a person, the green dominoes or something, they can choose to fall or refrain from falling. That ability thing, they have the control of whether they fall. What about the analogy doesn't make sense with the um yeah, with the domino analogy? I'm not sure what you mean by it doesn't work.
Well, I think that the analogy fails fundamentally for the very two reasons that I offered earlier. Number one, you've got no sentience, no consciousness, no sentience, and number two, you've got or you've got the causer in time causing subsequent events, namely these mind states and these conditions in which the dominoes find themselves that inevitably causes them to fall. Neither of those two things is necessarily true of compatibilism. You even modified the analogy to say that somehow God is sort of reaching in and tipping one of those over. But even now you've violated you've parted ways from the relationship that I've offered, which is more analogous to the relationship between an author and the characters in the story. The characters in the story that an author writes aren't dominoes simply being pushed over by a hand that reaches into the story and tips them over. In fact, let's take your domino analogy and combine it with my analogy. Imagine you've got a story written by person A, in which person B tips over the first in a series of dominoes. And according to the story the author writes, the person B tips over the first domino, and every single domino in the line successfully tips over the next domino in the line. Now you've got two kinds of causation in the story. You've got the kind of causation that's analogous to dominoes in a line, because it's in fact dominoes in a line. But then and that's the cause and effect, this every single effect in time, including the choices that human beings make and their very desires, are themselves simply dominoes tipped over by previous dominoes or previous effects in the causal chain. You've got something analogous to that in this story, and that's the chain of events triggered by person A. Or sorry, person B, the author, the character in the story. But person B is not being moved at the time that he or she chooses to tip over the first domino to tip over the first domino. The author is not reaching into the story and grabbing the person B's wrist and moving person B's hand up to the domino, extending person B's index finger, and then moving person B's index finger to the surface of the domino, and thereby causes it to fall over. None of that's happening. Do we know how person B is guaranteed to tip over that first domino because person A wrote the story? No, we don't have an explanation for that in this kind of transcendent relationship. But nevertheless, person A is not the same kind of cause as the dominoes in the line that he causes to tip over. So this is my problem with this analogy and all the other ones, is that it treats things as if they're analogous to dominoes in a line, when in fact you can bring dominoes or robots or puppets into this story that I've been describing, where a person in the story is tipping over the dominoes or pulling the strings on the puppet or programming the computer, and that person as a cause is not the same kind of cause in the story as the dominoes are. So it necessitates some sort of distinction in causation or control between the dominoes in the story and the agent in the story. Now, I don't deny. I'm not assuming that simply because you have to make this distinction, that therefore the real distinction, whatever that is, escapes the objection. I'm not assuming that. But I've also yet to given the right analogy, or at least a better analogy, which is this author and story analogy, I've still yet to see how the author foreordaining the character's actions in the story is susceptible to the same objection that these other analogies are, the dominoes and the puppeteer and so forth.
Yeah, it's yeah, I hear you that look, every analogy is like a bucket, it can only carry water so far. And your unique twist, which is interesting, and it's good for people to realize that there is that difference there between the domino thing. But I still think that the relevant objection, look, the story, neither character B nor character A had a genuine control over what they were doing, and however God does that, as He's the first mover cause of this, He is determining in however that works between the hypertime and the temporal, regular temporal dimension. It's still not true to say that person A and person B in the story have control over their actions. It's really the author has a real sense of control.
Well, and that's fine. I don't agree with that objection, but let's be clear, that objection needs, I think, to be based on an analogy that is more appropriate to what compatibilism actually entails, which is the analogy of the author and the story, not the analogy of dominoes, puppets, or robots. You might think that the characters in an author's story are as every bit as controlled by or caused by or what have you, the author, as dominoes and puppets and puppets are by the things that move them. You might think that, and that's fine, but you can't just simply assert that in my analogy they are susceptible to the same objection by appealing to disanalogous analogies. You can't say in your view the story is just like somebody in a line of dominoes because they're like somebody in a line of dominoes. That would be circular reasoning.
Gotcha. Okay. Cool.
And that's why I object to these analogies. You know, Leighton Flowers, and we consider each other friends, so I hold no ill will toward him, and I respect and admire the man. But this is, you know, this is why he'll say, look, I don't see any difference between your analogy, Chris, and these other analogies, and yet he consistently goes back to the disanalogous analogies and claims, just simply baldly asserts that my view is just as susceptible to the objection because, in my view, people are no different than puppets or robots or dominoes. But again, all that's doing is engaging in the circular reasoning. People are like puppets and robots and dominoes because they're like puppets, robots, and dominoes. You can't do that. So what I'm looking forward to hearing one day is a philosophically rigorous defense of the objection that takes into account the kind of relationship captured by my analogy, which is this transcendent relationship between God, who is outside of created time, and people who are inside of created time, and in which a person's choice to do A or not A is predetermined by the author, but is not in time caused by the author. Until and unless a philosophically rigorous defense of the objection to my view, given this analogy of the relationship between God and time, until I see that philosophically rigorous defense of the objection, I see no reason for thinking it to be persuasive.
Yeah, I know it's not the subject of our debate, but there are philosophical arguments that argue God has to be within our time. So
well, hold on a second. Before you, I want to hear your arguments. I do, but keep in mind that the thing that's going to be difficult for me to square with any conclusion that might result from your arguments is that we know that time is first of all, time is simply a measure of change, and in the material world, time as a measure of material change changes. The faster something moves, or the more strong gravitational pull is, time changes. And so if God is if you're going to offer philosophical arguments for thinking that God is inside time with us, then how is God, who is immaterial and is not comprised of the energy and matter that make up the cosmos and the information that makes up the cosmos, how then could he be inside of time when time itself is affected by energy and matter and information?
Interesting point. Yeah, I don't know. Do you want me?
Yeah,
to
please do offer the arguments. I'm interested.
Okay. So I'm going to be doing a show soon on the cosmological argument, in which I give four arguments for an A theory of time, and then four arguments, one of which is the relativity theory argument for the B theory of time. And actually, with relativity theory, there's a neo-Lorentzian interpretation. So no, our measures of time, metric time, is not equivalent to absolute time. And this is becoming a growing stance. It's still a minority view. Most scientists agree with your interpretation at the moment, but they are empirically equivalent. It's not, you can't prove that there is no absolute time frame or something like that. And in fact, general theory of relativity shows that there is this cosmic time. And using the special, this is off topic, so I don't know.
It's interesting though.
Yeah, like the special theory of relativity, it's very limited. It's just one type of movement, and it totally breaks down. So when you look at other non-uniform type of movement, like accelerated motion of light and stuff like that. So yeah, I don't know. I'll send you a link when I get that up, and I'd love to hear your thoughts if I could persuade you on this time thing, because that would knock out what you're saying. If God is,
yes, it would.
Awesome. All right. Yeah.
But here's what I will say. At least with the words that you've just used, you used words like absolute versus metric time. You've used the word cosmic time, which I assume is synonymous here with absolute time or whatever. It sounds to me like you're distinguishing between two kinds of time, which would work against divine timelessness, meaning God is timelessly eternal. He experiences no passage of time in his nature at all. But I don't see how it would work against the kind of, you've been using the word hypertime to describe God being outside of created time. I don't see how a distinction between two kinds of time, as you've just made in your use of absolute versus metric time, I don't understand how that works against a view in which God is also in a time, in absolute or hyper time, whatever you want to call it, even though created time is fully within his, he's completely transcendent over created time. But yes, please do send me the article. I'll be interested to read it. Yeah.
I'd love to get your advice on that. Yeah, your take on that for sure. All right, cool. So I was going to ask you about causal deviances, but I think that you've already, with your theistic determinism, you can overcome that, because they're really basically causal deviances are used to say, well, in terms of control, all of the necessary preconditions are present, but yet people will deviate from the expected choice or something. They don't knock down the thing. And typically this objection is raised to, materialistic determinism. You have your beliefs, you have your internal sets of desires and all of that, and those are the cause of the action. But you're saying no, it's an outside thing, God in a hyperdimension of time, that's doing this. And yeah, like I don't know, we would have, in order for the causal deviances thing to work, you would have to say, well, God, all of the factors that God uses to determine however he does that are the same, but yet deviances take place. And I don't know how I would go about proving that with that dimension. So I think we can move on to the rationality condition, the third condition. And this basically says, look, that people will have a reason or a rationale for why they do what they do. And with typical compatibilists, let's say, not necessarily, this isn't going to necessarily apply to Chris's take as a theistic determinist, but if it's their beliefs or sets, belief desire sets or internal personality traits that are the determining factors, and those are influenced by the surrounding circumstances, basically they serve as an efficient cause to produce the effects that take place. So they're determined by these efficient cause, which means that they're the means through which this decision takes place. Whereas libertarians, they say, first of all, we're totally undetermined. We may be influenced, and we choose to do this for a given reason or something like that, but we're more the final cause. So as this fundamental agent or substance, I have a goal. I want to cook up craft dinner. So therefore, that's the purpose or the teleos for why I'm causing this to happen. I choose to turn on the oven, and it cooks and takes place with the rest. So yeah, Chris, would want to get your take on the rationality condition. Are we merely efficient causes? How does God? Is there a difference? Perhaps we could approach it this way: is there a difference in terms of how God determines our quote unquote free choices versus how He determines natural events, like the water evaporating as it gets heated and stuff like that?
I do think there's a difference. It seems to me that natural events, God has arranged reality such that natural events are, generally speaking, the mechanistic results or effects of previous effects in time. But I don't think that's what compatibilism entails, and that's where I think that this claim that Moreland and Craig make, that in my view, reasons are efficient causes, whereas in libertarianism, reasons are final causes. I don't think that categorization works, because it assumes, even in the very way that you just characterized it, but also in the way that they write it, it assumes that the choice a human being makes is the inevitable effect of an efficient. That's what inevitable means here. The cause is efficient in as much as it affects the effect. Right. And in this case, the allegedly efficient cause is a reason. So a person, by whatever means God chooses to use, becomes aware of some reason, and that reason is efficient to bring about the action. That's the way that Moreland and Craig are claiming human beings are rational in compatibilism. But I've consistently said throughout the course of this interview that that's not something that compatibilism necessarily entails or assumes. It's not the case. Going back to my analogy of the author writing a story in which person B knocks over the first domino, it might be that God has written a story such that person B decides or becomes aware of a reason to push down the first domino, to set up the dominoes and push them down, or whatever. Maybe it's because he or she wants to win a competition. I remember, for example, in America's Got Talent, there was one season in which somebody appeared in a few rounds of the competition and set up this huge round of dominoes and knocks them down. Huh?
I remember that. I saw that one.
Yeah. So it could be that the person tips over the dominoes because they have a reason for doing so, which in this case would be to win the America's Got Talent. But it's conceivable that somebody might choose to do something for other reasons that they're not aware of, or for no reason at all, and it wouldn't make it any less predetermined. It would just mean that the reasons that the person has aren't efficient causes for what they do, even if they are the final causes. So again, I think that the claim breaks down precisely because, and in fact, I'm beginning to think that every single one of these categorizations they make is based on this fundamental flaw in their analogies, which is that the choices a person makes is the inevitable result of previous results in time. In this case, the previous result in time is the reason, the awareness of the reason that the person comes to, that inevitably results in the effect, which is their action. But that's not an accurate analogy to capture the relationship between God and humans in compatibilism.
Okay, so I wanted to probe you then. So given that your thing is true, instead of belief desire sets, we can setting God as providing those reasons, which they serve as the efficient causes, or whatever you want to say. But okay, do you believe we experience on a phenomenological level this process of deliberation, rational deliberation, where we weigh pros and cons and that sort of thing? Um, I was going to say, like, yeah, in the first place, well, how do you make sense of this experienced phenomenon that seems to make us sort of the agent, we're the final causes in terms of why we do it, as opposed to some external force in terms of why I make a choice to go to Ryerson for school or something like that. Yeah, what do you make of this phenomenon of deliberation? How does that fit into your worldview there?
Well, just plug it into the analogy that I've been offering. So let's say that the author writes a story in which person B can either tip over the domino and thereby trigger the series of causes and events that cause all the all the dominoes to fall, or they could not. And so in the story, person B deliberates between the various reasons he or she might choose or choose not to tip over that first domino. Maybe if he or she tips over the first domino and it triggers all the dominoes over, he or she will win a prize. But let's say that the downside is that his or her best friend, who is also in the competition, might lose the prize. And let's say that person B knows that that would be a very emotionally tragic event for his or her friend. Well, so now person B is going to sit there in the story and deliberate, the author writes, between hurting his or her friend's feelings and thereby winning the competition, or do I want to intentionally not win the competition so as to allow my friend to win the competition, and because I can take the loss emotionally better than my friend can? Well, the fact that the author has written in the story that this is the deliberation through which person B goes and then ultimately decides to do it doesn't take away from the fact that the person is in fact deliberating. It just means that all of the deliberating is itself preordained or foreordained by the author of the story. Now, does that instantaneously resolve the objection? I'm not proposing that it does, but what it does mean is that the deliberation isn't unreal. It's just preordained, and what they deliberate is guaranteed to come about based on the foreordination, and how the result of the deliberation is guaranteed to come about in the way that the author has said that the deliberation will play out. We don't know what the relationship is between those two things, but because of this transcendence between author and story, it's certainly not analogous to one person, the author tipping over a domino, which is the character in the story who then doesn't do any deliberation, just falls into the next domino. That just would not be analogous.
All right, yeah, I'll let you have the last word. I just noticed, I was so engrossed in this conversation. I just noticed we're at the 2 hours.
It's a lot of fun to talk about.
Exactly, yeah. As long as you're having a good time and enjoying it, I'm willing to go longer. So perfect. So yeah, I think we covered the fourth thing, causation, and I think you did a great job of countering that, or giving the Calvinist take on that from this theistic determined. You just deny that, compatibilism entails event causation or whatever. God is an agent, and he's inputting into the system through whatever mechanism, unknown mechanism that he does. But I did, just before we move on to the predestination part, I did want to get your take in terms of the person as an agent, because you've said many times you call human beings agents, and William Lane Craig and J.P. Moreland deny this. They just see that on a compatibilist view, human persons are simply a series of events, instrumental causes and that sort of thing. So yeah, I guess I'll give it to you just to give sort of like what's your quickly your counter to this. Do you actually see people as agents, in like full-fledged agents? Are they genuine substances, or are they just mere property things that are instrumental means through which God achieves his end goal or something?
Yeah, I mean, go back to the way that Moreland and Craig justify their claim that, in my view, people could be substances but need not be. That would only be true. I mean, basically what they're saying is people could be substances, in which case it would have to be theistic determinism, but people could also be just property things, but that would only be true in materialistic determinism. Right? It's only a materialistic determinism. Well, I mean, I don't know. I suppose a theistic determinist could say that the way that God guarantees that what He foreordains comes to pass is by setting up a series of cause and effect in time that necessarily brings about what they ultimately do. In which case, yes, I think it could be argued that people are merely property things and not genuine personal substances. So I would think that they could be right. Yeah, I will grant them this one. I will say that it is possible in compatibilism for human beings to be either person things or substances, but that in libertarianism, people must be substances. I'm willing to grant that, but even granting that, that doesn't mean that a theistic determinist or compatibilist is required to believe that people are merely property things. Because, as I've said, I'm not a compatibilist who thinks that people's decisions are, in fact, the effects of cause and effect chains in time. So, in my view, people are personal substances and not merely person things. So, while other theistic determinists could treat people as person things, doesn't seem to have much bearing on whether theistic determinism more broadly is true or not.